So in the previous lecture, we used client-side data fetching to load the news data. And as a result, if you go to the news page and you inspect the source code, you will see that in there, you see a lot of content, but you won't see the actual news content here. If we search for Beaver, which is part of one of the news headlines, we don't have any match in here. Because the content that's generated on the server, the page content that's generated there, does not include those news because we fetched them on the client side with help of useEffect. Now, as you see, of course, that works, but as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture already, this is not the best way of fetching data when using Next.js. Because even though that is how you can fetch data in any React app, Next.js offers better ways of fetching data. Because in Next.js, all those components, including all those page components, as you learned, by default are React server components. So React components that are meant to execute on the server. And as it turns out, those React server components got some nice tricks up their sleeve. Most importantly, you can fetch data directly inside of them and decorate the component functions with async in order to use async await. So put in other words, React server components can return promises instead of just JSX. And that's something traditional client-side React components can't do. But React server components can do that, and since Next.js supports them, you can therefore fetch data directly inside of those components when working with Next.js. Therefore, what we can do here is get rid of that use client directive again to convert this back to a server component, get rid of useEffect here, and move this code here, where we send that request out of the fetch news function directly into the component function. We can and should now also get rid of all these states and of all that code here that updates those different states. I'll just keep this line of code where I parse the response data, but I'll get rid of all that other code. That, of course, also means that I'll get rid of these if checks, and I'll show you how to still show error and loading fallbacks a little bit later. For now, we'll get rid of that. So now we have much simpler code here, and we're sending that request from directly inside the component function, since it's such a server component. It's worth noting that this fetch function is available here, even though that code runs on the server, because A, it's supported by Node.js, which executes that server-side code anyways, and B, Next.js extends this fetch function and adds some extra caching-related features to it. Though that's not too important here, we'll take a closer look at caching and what Next.js does for you in the next course sections. So for now, it's just important to understand that you can use fetch directly inside of a component function. Of course, now we can and should also remove the useEffect and use state imports. Now, the request could still fail, so I still want to check if not response okay. And in that case, I'll just throw a new error, where I'll say failed to fetch news, and we'll handle that error a little bit later. For the moment, let's focus on outputting the news. How would that work? Well, we don't need to check whether they're defined or not, because now, since we have an async component, we wait until the response data is there anyways. No JSX code gets generated before that data is there, so we won't have a scenario where news is undefined unless the backend returns undefined, which my dummy backend here doesn't do though. It always returns this array of news. So therefore, this check is not required anymore, and hence we can again move that news list component down into the returned JSX code and get rid of that extra variable. And that's therefore all the code it takes when using Next.js features to fetch data directly on the server inside of the component function and to output it. And therefore now if we save that and reload that news page, you see the news data is there directly on the page, but now if we take a look at the page source code, we will also see that all the news content is in there, so it was rendered on the server. And that, of course, for example, gives us an SEO advantage. And hence, fetching data directly inside of the component is the standard approach you should use when using Next.js.